Thanks for joining me today. Today we're going to be discussing mandatory reporters of vulnerable adult abuse, neglect, and exploitation. My name is Greg Brockmeyer. I'm a program specialist with the Department of Health and Human Services. I specifically work with the Adult Protective Services Unit. I provide training and policy and consultation with the field. And today, obviously, we're going to be talking about mandatory reporting and what responsibilities mandatory reporters are. And we'll get into the specific objectives here in just a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today. But we need your help. In 2010 alone, Adult Protective Services received nearly 11,000 reports of possible abuse, neglect, or exploitation of vulnerable adults. That's a pretty high figure, but there's estimates out there, according to the Journal of Elder Abuse Attorneys, that 84% of abuse goes unreported. The reports that we do receive, most of those reports concern people who are living in the community, are unable to care for themselves, or and living in unsafe conditions. The most common forms of perpetrated abuse that are perpetrated upon vulnerable adults by others, are neglect and financial exploitation. And we'll get into some of those figures a little bit later in the presentation. In this course, we're specifically going to be talking about who is required to make a report when they come across vulnerable adult abuse, neglect, or exploitation. What are the rights and responsibilities of mandatory reporters? How, when, what, and whom to report suspected vulnerable adult abuse, neglect, and exploitation. We're also going to be talking about indicators of vulnerable adult abuse and neglect and exploitation, and what to look for and when we're coming across those situations. And we'll talk also a little bit today about what Adult Protective Services is, what it does, and the goals of Adult Protective Services. So first off, who is a mandatory reporter and what is a mandatory reporter? A mandatory reporter is a person who is required by the Adult Protective Services Act, which is an act that was passed by the Nebraska State Legislature, so it is in law, and they're required to report situations in which they have a reasonable cause to believe that a vulnerable adult has been subjected to abuse, neglect, or exploitation, or they observe such an adult being subjected to those conditions or circumstances, and those conditions and circumstances would reasonably result in that. You do not have to witness it, but if there's anything that causes you to believe that it's occurring, you're required to make that report. The Nebraska Adult Protective Services Act is found in the Nebraska Revised Statutes in sections 28.348 to section 28.387. Mandatory reporters include a wide variety of people who are professionals, volunteers, or otherwise work in a field that comes across vulnerable adults or children. They include physicians, psychologists, physician's assistants, nurses, nurse assistants, any other medical professionals. Developmental disability professionals are included, as well as mental health professionals, law enforcement personnel, caregivers, employees of caregivers, operators or employees of sheltered workshops, owners, operators, or employees of facilities that are licensed by the Department of Health and Human Services, and any other human services professional or paraprofessional. One key to remember in mandatory reporters, you don't have to be paid to be a mandatory reporter. If you work or volunteer in this field that comes across children, vulnerable adults, or works in some sort of caregiving capacity, you're required to make those reports. Mandatory reporters do not include clergy, financial institutions, or other members of the general public. They can make a report, and we do receive lots of reports from those people, but they're not required by law to do so, and there's no penalty for failing to do so for those individuals who are in that capacity. If you're an employer of a mandatory reporter, one of the responsibilities that you do have is you should notify mandatory reporters of their responsibility to report. Many agencies, they have this training. It's part of their new worker training. They include it. And if you are an agency that does have mandatory reporters working for you, I encourage you to develop a training or have someone come train you on what the responsibilities for mandatory reporter is and help them become aware of that. As employers, you should also establish in-house procedures for making a report. When we have people that work in agencies, and there's a lot of people that come in contact with the same instance of abuse, neglect, or exploitation, we don't necessarily need to have multiple reports of the same incident. So if you have in-house procedures, you may have one person that's identified as a reporter, or you have a specific chain of command that the report goes through, and that's okay as long as those procedures are followed and reporters are aware of those and know how they work. Employers should not prohibit employees from making a report. When employees who are mandatory reporters come across something, they're required to make sure a report has happened or the procedures were followed. And if an employee is prohibiting an employee from making a report, they're in essence encouraging their employee to break the law, which is obviously unethical. Some of the responsibilities of mandatory reporters: to make a report in a timely manner. So that's basically to make the report immediately upon discovery of the abuse or having causes to believe it occurred. Sometimes as a mandatory reporter, you may have to look into a situation a little more closely to find out if there is actual reason to believe it's occurring. But as soon as you become aware or have that reason to believe, you should make that report. Some agencies do their own internal investigations. The mandatory report should not come at the end of that investigation. It should come at the time that the person has reason to believe it occurred. So that may be prior to the end of an investigation that's internal to a facility or agency. If there are in-house procedures for reporting, ensuring that those procedures were followed. And if the mandatory reporters finds out that those procedures were not followed, then to go ahead and make that report themselves. Reporters also should share information, records, or reports that document the basis for an investigation. That information sharing would be within investigators, whether it's Adult Protective Services, whether it's law enforcement, or other agency that has the responsibility to investigate that abuse, neglect, or exploitation. And if it's requested, to provide a written report to Adult Protective Services within 48 hours of that request. Now, you're not going to have to make that written report in every case. It's only when it's requested by the Adult Protective Services investigator or the intake worker who is taking the report. And if it's not requested, you do not necessarily need to provide that, but there may be times where you're asked to do so. When you're making a report, whether it's written or just a call into the hotline, there are certain things that we ask that you have available when you're making that report. And those reports include the name, address, and age of the adult, name and address of any caregivers who are involved with that adult, whether they have physicians or other people who are helping with the person, the nature and the extent of the abuse or the circumstances of the abuse, neglect, or exploitation, any evidence of previous abuse. So if you know a history regarding this person or the victim or the perpetrator, that's always very useful when you're making that report. Any other information that is helpful in establishing the cause of the alleged abuse. And we also want to make sure we want to have the identity of the alleged perpetrators if that's known. Now, if all this information isn't available to you at that time, that's okay. Provide the information that you do have, and the investigator or the intake worker will make calls and try to get the information that's missing. One thing that we ask a lot of times that's very helpful in identifying people is if you do have access to the social security numbers of anyone involved, the victim, the perpetrator, or others, to provide that information. It makes it much easier for the hotline and the investigator to identify who that person is. We have a lot of people in the state of Nebraska who have the same name or similar names, and that extra identifying information, birth date, social security number, really helps us make sure we have the right person who we're assigning the intake to and the investigation to as well. A note regarding HIPAA: the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act allows for the release of records for individuals who are suspected of being victims of abuse, neglect, and exploitation in states where there are laws that require the release of such information. Nebraska happens to be one of those states that has that law. Nebraska's law requires that mandatory reporters share relevant information with the Department of Health and Human Services for the purposes of an Adult Protective Services investigation. So there does not need to be a HIPAA waiver signed or anything like that when there's an investigation going on. That information can be released as it pertains to that investigation. And the Adult Protective Services investigator would request that of you, and they would let you know that information that they are asking for. Some rights of mandatory reporters. Mandatory reporters have the right to be immune from civil or criminal liability when they're making a report or cooperating with an investigation. That pertains in all cases except where there's willful or wanton neglect of duty or when false statements are made with malicious intent. So if someone's making a report to get someone else in trouble and there's no basis for that and it's a false statement, they're not going to be immune from liability in those cases. Reporters also have the right to have protection of their identity. They can remain anonymous if they choose so. The Department of Health and Human Services is not going to release the name of any reporters except to law enforcement, county attorneys or attorney generals, or if there's a court order requiring that release to occur. And rights and mandatory reports also include they're permitted to release confidential information to APS without penalty, and that pertains to the HIPAA as we already talked about. When you are making a report, there is a centralized hotline for making a report. It's the Adult and Child Abuse and Neglect Hotline. So there's one number to report abuse to the Department of Health and Human Services, whether it's a vulnerable adult or a child. And that number is 1-800-652-1999. Or you can make that report to law enforcement as well. And we encourage you, if there's emergency situations or a crime happening at the moment, to call law enforcement first and then call the hotline. Usually if you need law enforcement or immediate action, that's probably the best way to go. And then the department can follow up with a vulnerable adult investigation through APS. Adult Protective Services doesn't have after-hours workers or on-call workers, so if there's an emergency, law enforcement or emergency personnel would be the way to go in those cases, and then a follow-up call to the hotline. There is a penalty for failing to make a report. Any person who willfully fails to make a report required by the Adult Protective Services Act may be guilty of a Class 3 misdemeanor. That carries a maximum penalty of 3 months in prison, $500 fine, or both. That's people who are willfully doing that. If you are working in a facility and you believe a report's been made, and you, at the time, you do not make a report because you think it's already been made, you're not willfully failing to make that report. But if you do find out that it wasn't made and then choose not to, then that would fall under that willfully failing to make a report. Hopefully this is not used, and hopefully all the agencies do have in-house procedures, and people who are mandatory reporters are aware of their responsibility, and they do make the reports as necessary. So now we have to get into who is a vulnerable adult. So when we're making reports of vulnerable adult abuse, neglect, and exploitation, we need to know two things. We need to know what a vulnerable adult is and how it's defined and what that entails. We also need to know what is the abuse as it is defined in the Adult Protective Services Act. So who is a vulnerable adult? Vulnerable adult is any person 18 years of age or older who has a substantial mental impairment, a substantial functional impairment, or a guardian appointed by a Nebraska court. A substantial mental impairment means a substantial disorder of thought, mood, perception, orientation, or memory that grossly impairs judgment, behavior, or the ability to live independently or provide self-care. Grossly impaired judgment means that someone is making decisions that are not typical of a normal person. They may be putting themselves in danger and not realizing the consequences of their action. The behavior is really the behavior that's resulting from that poor judgment, and persons behaving in a way that they're at risk. And it's due to some sort of disorder of thought, mood, perception, orientation, or memory. Those disorders can also cause someone to not be able to live independently or care for themselves. So they're not able to bathe themselves, they're not able to maintain their personal hygiene, or they're not able to maintain their personal safety, and maybe they need supervision that a person who does not have some of those disorders may not need. A vulnerable adult also includes people who have substantial functional impairments. And a substantial functional impairment means a substantial incapability because of some physical limitation of living independently or providing self-care. So there has to be some sort of physical limitation, whether it's inability to move or be mobile or transfer themselves, or maybe someone has a requirement of using a wheelchair, they're unable to walk, and it's to the extent where they can't care for themselves. Many people have limitations and impairments, but are still able to live independently and provide self-care. And if they're living independently and providing self-care, they would not be considered vulnerable adult, despite their mental impairment or their functional impairment. We have many people who live successfully in the community with mental impairments that are being treated effectively, and they would not be vulnerable adults because they're living independently and they're able to care for themselves. And the same with individuals with physical impairments that are able to live independently. If a person has a guardian appointed by a Nebraska court, that means that they are automatically considered a vulnerable adult. We do not have to know anything about their functional abilities or their mental abilities. If there's a guardian, they're automatically considered a vulnerable adult. What is vulnerable adult abuse? A vulnerable adult abuse is any knowing, intentional, or negligent act or omission on the part of a caregiver, a vulnerable adult, or any other person which results in physical injury, unreasonable confinement, cruel punishment, sexual abuse, exploitation, or denial of essential services. And we'll get into what each of those are specifically in the next few minutes. But first, we want to take a look at the number of reports that Adult Protective Services have received over the years. And you'll see quite a large increase in the last 4 or 5 years in the number of reports we have received through the Adult Protective Services hotline, the Adult and Child Abuse Neglect Hotline. In 2006, we had a huge increase, and some of those increases are the result of federal regulations requiring facilities such as nursing homes to make those reports to the hotline. But there's also a growing population of people who are vulnerable, people who are elderly and are becoming disabled, not able to care for themselves anymore, and that accounts for a large number of increase in the reports we receive, whether it's in a facility or it's in the community. We're receiving increases in both areas. The percentage of the types of abuse that we're receiving in reports, the largest percentage of reports that we do receive are self-neglect cases, which is approximately about a third of our cases. Neglect by a caregiver is just under a third. Financial exploitation is about under a quarter of all the reports, about 24% of all the reports we receive. Physical abuse is just under 10%. And sexual abuse is just under 3%. So as we mentioned earlier, the two largest categories of perpetrator abuse are neglect and financial exploitation. But the largest that we see in Adult Protective Services is self-neglect, where a person is unable to care for themselves and there's no one there to care for them, no caregiver in place. The number of substantiated abuse that we see in percentage-wise, we are able to substantiate self-neglect a lot. That's really because there is no perpetrator. We don't have to show that anyone is abusing, neglecting, or exploiting someone. We just have to show that this person is unable to care for themselves and they're in a dangerous situation. When we look at financial exploitation, we're able to substantiate 19% of the cases of financial exploitation. And one of the reasons for that is there's paper trails with financial exploitation. We have bank records, and it's really a lot simpler, easier to show that it's occurring. Physical abuse, we'll be able to substantiate about 10% of that. Sexual abuse, approximately 13%, and neglect, 8%. In many cases with neglect, it's hard to show responsibility of a caregiver to provide the care, and that was actually the cause of physical injury or someone being in a dangerous situation. So it's one of the most difficult things to substantiate, and hence it has the lowest percentage of substantiation. Who are the victims of abuse, neglect, and exploitation? When we look at age groups, we have the ages go all the way from 18 to over 100 years old who are being abused, neglected, or exploited. The largest group by far is the 65 to 84-year-olds and the 85-plus group. When you look at the 85-plus group, there's only 2% of our population, but they account for 17% of all of the victimizations that we have. And if you look at 65 and older, it's about 54%. And so it's over half of all of our abuse, neglect, and exploitation includes the elderly population. Now, not all elders are vulnerable adults, but it accounts for the largest group that we have when we're looking at abuse, neglect, and exploitation of vulnerable adults. Females are more likely than males to be victims of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And when we look at the population figures as according to race, in the state of Nebraska, it's a predominantly Caucasian state, so hence we're going to have that's going to be the largest group of victims by race. But if you look at African Americans, Hispanics, and Native Americans, those figures are lower. But African Americans only account for about 4 or 5% of our population, but 9% of our victims. And Hispanics is about the opposite. They're about 6% of our population, but 3% of our victims. And they're just disproportionately represented in the figures we receive. And there may be lots of factors that go into that. It could be family dynamics, cultural factors, but we have to be aware of that when we're making reports and we're looking into the situations, to be aware of the cultural influences that may play a role in the reports that we do receive about victims of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Now, who are the perpetrators? Most commonly, perpetrators are going to be individuals who are known and have some sort of close relationship to the victim. The most common perpetrator we see of abuse, neglect, and exploitation are children and grandchildren. One of the biggest factors causing that is children and grandchildren are more often going to be a caregiver to an elderly person, or a power of attorney or a guardian to an elderly person. And that may, since they have that power and since they're given that control, are put in that position, they're more likely to either fail in their caregiving duties or have an opportunity to financially exploit someone or become physically abusive towards a vulnerable adult or other types of abuse as well. Facility staff are also high on that list as well, and that's because of their proximity and their control, and they're responsible for cares. And the closer someone is to an individual, the more opportunity they have to be abusive, neglectful, or exploitative. There is a penalty for vulnerable adult abuse. If someone's convicted of a crime and they've committed knowing, intentional abuse of vulnerable adult through a knowing and intentional act or permits the vulnerable adult to be abused, they may be guilty of a Class 3A felony. There's a maximum penalty of 5 years imprisonment, $10,000 fine, or both. That is if someone's convicted in a criminal court or they plead guilty or no contest to charges related to vulnerable adult abuse. There is also Adult Protective Services Central Registry. The department, through an APS investigation, may find that a person more likely than not committed abuse of a vulnerable adult or neglect or exploitation. And if they find that, they're going to place the person who is the alleged perpetrator on the Central Registry. The Central Registry, its primary use is to conduct complete pre-employment checks for employees or volunteers working with vulnerable adults or children. It's not a public registry, and it's not a criminal registry. You hear a lot of information out there about the sex offender registry. That's a criminal registry. The sex offender registry contains names of people who've been convicted of crimes. Someone who's on the Adult Protective Services Central Registry may not have necessarily been convicted of a crime, but there was an investigation conducted by the department which found that more likely than not they did commit that abuse, neglect, or exploitation. It's a much lower requirement of evidence. If you're convicted in criminal court, you have to have beyond reasonable doubt. If you're found to have committed abuse in a APS investigation, it only requires a preponderance of evidence, so more likely than not that the person did that. So it's not a criminal registry, and it's not a public registry. And since it's not a public registry, the public can't go in and search to see who's on there. The only time a person's information is released from the registry is if the alleged perpetrator whose name is put on the registry is getting a employment check or get background check, and they sign a release allowing that information to be released to the agency or whoever's requesting that background check. The only information that is released when that happens is if there is a record found or if there's no record found. So the details of that investigation are not released as well. And if someone is put on the Central Registry, they can request an expungement from that Central Registry, and then when they do so, there will be a review of the expungement. And if if their request is denied, they may still request a hearing and appeal that as well. So there is ways to get removed from the Adult Protective Service Central Registry as well. The types of abuse defined in the Adult Protective Services Act. We're going to talk a little more specifically about what is those types of abuse. We see physical abuse, unreasonable confinement, cruel punishment, sexual abuse, denial of essential services, exploitation. A couple of the types of abuse that are not included in the Adult Protective Services Act: verbal abuse, psychological abuse, or emotional abuse. Since those are not included in the Adult Protective Services Act, if APS receives a report of those types of abuse through the hotline, they are not assigned to an APS investigator. We do not have the authority to investigate those specific types of abuse. They may be part of another case if there's physical abuse or exploitation occurring, and there's also physical abuse or emotional or verbal abuse or emotional abuse occurring. They may be included in that overall investigation, but those types of abuse alone will not initiate an APS investigation. So when we talk specifically about the types, we'll first talk about physical abuse. Physical abuse is damage caused by non-therapeutic contact, which results in a physical injury. Non-therapeutic contact is basically a way to say something it's not accidental and it's not an injury resulting of something that's useful for the person. An example that we use a lot in these trainings is someone who's receiving dialysis. If someone is receiving dialysis, a lot of times they'll have a lot of bruising around the area. Well, that's a physical injury, but it's done for therapeutic reasons, so that would not constitute physical abuse. Physical abuse does not include accidents that result in physical injury. But the injuries that are included in the APS Act are fractures, bruises, lacerations, internal injuries, dislocations, and also includes pain, illness, and impairment of physical function. So if someone has severe pain as a result of physical abuse, that would be included in that type of abuse. Or if there's some sort of impairment of physical function, someone is unable to walk as a result of the abuse, or maybe they lose one of their senses, or they're unable to hear as a result of it, some sort of function that you would have normally, and as a result of the abuse, it is no longer there, that would constitute physical injury as well. Unreasonable confinement. Unreasonable confinement is confinement which intentionally causes injury. And that includes restraint usage outside of the approved practices and regulations, and when it's used outside of those practices and it results in injury, that is a form of abuse called unreasonable confinement. Chemical restraints used outside of approved practices and regulations that results in injury, including impairment of physical function, would also be including that. And it could also cause someone to become ill as well. And the intentional over-medication resulting in injury or an impairment of physical function or illness would also be included in that form of abuse. Someone may also be confined in an enclosed space or room that results in injury, or the confinement has lasted for such a time that their functioning is impaired, or they've received injuries as a result of that. That would fall under this form of abuse as well. Cruel punishment. Cruel punishment is punishment which intentionally causes physical injury. It's real similar to physical abuse, but the intent of this form of abuse is to punish the victim in some fashion. It could also include withholding food, water, medications as a form of punishment. So those types of things would be included in this form of abuse as well. Some physical indicators of physical abuse, unreasonable confinement, and cruel punishment. If someone has bruises from hitting, shoving, slapping, punching, or kicking. Maybe someone has bilateral injuries or injuries on the upper arms, face, neck, or clustered on other body parts. Burns caused by cigarettes or objects, or burns in the shape of objects, or bilateral burns. Frictions from rope, chains, or other physical restraints. Injuries caused by biting, cutting, poking, punching, whipping, or twisting of limbs. Disorientation, stupor, or other effects of deliberate over-medication, open wounds, cuts, punctures, untreated injuries, and injuries in various stages of healing, or just a person's report of being mistreated. There's a lot of indicators here of physical abuse, unreasonable confinement, and cruel punishment. Some of these injuries may be caused by accidents, but they're an indicator. So if you see something like this, if you see bilateral bruising or bilateral injuries, that's a red flag that something may happen, and you may want to report that or look into the situation a little more closely to see if you do need to report it, if there is a suspicion of physical abuse or these other forms of abuse occurring. Some of the behavioral indicators of physical abuse, unreasonable confinement, and cruel punishment include these information, but these aren't specific to these types of abuse. You may also find these behavioral indicators in sexual abuse. You may also find them in neglect, or even financial exploitation. But if someone is being abused, they may exhibit some of these indicators. They might be easily frightened or fearful. Maybe they're exhibiting denial of what a situation or what's going on with them. They may be agitated. Maybe they're hesitant to talk openly. Maybe have implausible stories or explanations for what occurred. And that can happen with both the victim or the alleged perpetrator. They may be extremely upset when they're being physically treated or cared for. Maybe they're exhibiting depression or poor self-esteem, which is unusual for them. They might have eating disturbances or compulsive behavior happening, or sleep disturbances or sleep disorders. There may also be some interactions between the victim or the abuser which are unusual, which may cause red flags to go up. Maybe they have inconsistencies in how they describe an event or accounts for what occurred or the injuries. Maybe the family does not interact with the client, so maybe there's a lack of support system. It's a red flag. Does not necessarily mean that abuse is occurring, but it's a concern that we might want to look into and find out why it's occurring, and if there's injuries also occurring at the same time, especially during family visits. Maybe there's other types of marital or family discord occurring. In cases of neglect, maybe the caregiver lacks knowledge of their needs and conditions, or maybe they're overwhelmed and stressed, and that's causing them to be abusive and neglectful. It's not an excuse for abuse, but it is something that plays a role in it. And maybe a doctor or hospital, they're going from doctor to doctor, hospital to hospital, so the doctor or medical professional can't see a pattern of abuse occurring. And that really any change in a person's behavior, sudden changes of behavior, causes red flags, should cause a red flag to go up that maybe we need to take a look at this person a little more closely, find out what's going on, especially when those changes in behavior are occurring around the same time as an injury or some other significant event. Sexual abuse. Now, when sexual abuse occurs, sexual abuse is some sort of sexual contact or penetration without the consent of the victim, or when the person knew or should have known that the victim was physically or mentally unable of resisting, whether physically or mentally resisting or appraising the nature of the act. Or it can include any other sexually oriented practice, act, or conduct, including sexual exploitation, when that's occurring without the consent of the victim, or when the person should have known that the victim was mentally or physically unable of resisting or appraising the act. Sexual abuse also includes incest when it's happening to a vulnerable adult. One of the most difficult things about sexual abuse is to determine if, especially when a vulnerable adult has a mental impairment, when they are unable to consent. And one of the typical things that we think of when we're talking about consent is, do they understand the nature of the act? Do they understand the consequences of the act? And so when it comes to sexual contact, do they understand, if it's sexual intercourse, could someone become pregnant, or STDs? Those types of things influence the person's ability to consent. But a lot of times we have medical professionals or psychologists or psychiatrists who are able to examine and give a better explanation of a person's ability to consent, and they have to be assessed, especially when it comes to a sexual abuse incident, and we need to be able to show that the person could or could not consent. Some physical indicators of sexual abuse may include bruises, lacerations, bleeding, or welts around the breast or genital area, unexplained venereal diseases or genital infections, unexplained vaginal or anal bleeding, unexplained pregnancies, torn, stained, or bloody underclothing or bed sheets, painful urination or sitting, difficulty walking or sitting. A person's report of being sexually assaulted or raped is also a very important indicator. If someone reports that they're being assaulted or raped or sexually contacted without their consent, that you have to take those reports very seriously and make sure that you do report those to law enforcement and to the abuse and neglect hotline. Some behavioral indicators of sexual abuse. Someone may be demonstrating inappropriate sexual relationships. Whether it's the victim or the perpetrator, one or both may be exhibiting that inappropriate relationship. Maybe they're exhibiting inappropriate, unusual, or aggressive sexual behavior. That can be an indicator that sexual abuse is occurring, especially when that person has not had that type of behavior in their history. Maybe they're having extreme anxiety, maybe they're having difficulty sleeping, eating, or becoming fearful or compulsive in their behavior. They may also exhibit agitation or anger towards a particular caregiver, or it could be any caregiver or another person. Maybe they're feeling confused. They might exhibit signs of emotional disorders. They may also become extremely upset when they're being assisted with bathing or other physical caregiving. Regressive behavior may occur. This happens commonly in individuals with developmental disabilities. When they are being sexually abused, they might exhibit behavior which is more childlike than would be normal for them. They may also have nightmares or sleep disturbances occurring in this when those are occurring as well. So you will see a lot of similarities between the behavioral indicators for sexual abuse and the behavioral indicators for some of the other forms of abuse as well. Denial of essential services, which is the term for neglect that's used in the Adult Protective Services Act. It means that essential services are denied or neglected to such an extent that there's an actual physical injury or there's imminent danger of physical injury or death. The essential services that they're referring to include sufficient and appropriate food and clothing, temperate and sanitary shelter, treatment for physical needs, and proper supervision. It can include other things, but those are the types of services that are explicitly pointed out in the Adult Protective Services Act that need to be provided when there's a caregiver in place, and if it's not being provided, that would constitute neglect or denial of essential services. It can also be a vulnerable adult who is self-neglecting to the extent that there's physical injury, imminent danger of physical injury or death. A little bit more about self-neglect. Self-neglect is when someone it's a result of someone's inability due to physical and or mental impairments or diminished capacity to perform essential care tasks. And that can include all those essential services that we talked about before, providing food, clothing, shelter, and medical care, or obtaining goods and services necessary to maintain their physical health, their mental health, emotional well-being, and general safety, and or managing their financial affairs. So if one of those types of services or one of those areas is being neglected to the extent to the point where someone is going to be in a dangerous situation, where they're going to be injured or there's imminent danger of injury, or maybe say they're mismanaging their financial affairs because of that mental impairment and they're going to be evicted out into the streets, that could be an example of self-neglect due to that mismanagement of financial affairs. One thing to remember about self-neglect, it's not a lifestyle choice. Self-neglect is because of that inability due to physical and mental impairments or diminished capacity that they can't do this. We have a lot of people who do live in our communities that choose to live in ways that are harmful to themselves and others. And as long as they have that ability to choose that, we do not have the right to interfere with that choice. Unless they're committing a crime or they're harming other people, they can make that choice. And there may be other alternatives to intervention, but the Adult Protective Services would most likely not be able to intervene when they're able to make that choice. Some physical indicators of denial of essential services or neglect. Someone may be dehydrated. If they've developed bed sores or pressure sores, maybe they're not being treated. Untreated injuries or untreated medical problems. Poor hygiene is a very common indicator we see a lot. Hunger and malnutrition, pallor or sunken eyes or cheeks. A lack of clean bedding or clothing, lack of glasses, hearing aids, dentures, prosthetic devices, or any other device that someone should have access to be able to care for themselves or live in a way that would be useful for them. If that assisted device is not around, or it's been taken or stolen, or it's just lost, that could be an indicator that something's going on. Maybe there's some sort of skin disorder or rash appearing due to some of the lack of care, lack of prescribed medication, especially when that medication's been prescribed recently, and there should be plenty available to a person, or a person's report of being mistreated, and you'll see that in all the indicators we talk about. Some behavioral indicators of denial of essential services or neglect. Someone may be unresponsive or helpless. Maybe they don't have the ability to help themselves or find someone to care for them. If there's a caregiver in place and that caregiver is not providing what they need, maybe they don't know how to find a person to help or know how to make a report to get help. Or commonly in self-neglect cases, there was never a caregiver in place at all. Maybe the person's appearing detached. They may be hopeless. They may have unrealistic expectations about their care. Maybe they think someone can provide more than what they actually can. One of the strongest indicators or red flags for neglect or denial of essential services is isolation. If a person doesn't have a support system, friends, family, neighbors, church members, that person is at a much higher risk to being neglected, whether it's self-neglect or whether it's perpetrated neglect as well. Exploitation. Now, exploitation is the taking of property of a vulnerable adult by means of undue influence, breach of fiduciary relationship, deception, extortion, or any unlawful means. Undue influence is when someone is basically manipulating someone into giving up their property or giving up their money. They may be pressuring that maybe it's a family member and they say, if you don't give me this money, I'm going to place you in a nursing home. Or if you don't give me this car, we're not going to come visit you. That's unduly influencing someone. A breach of fiduciary relationship is someone who is in a position of trust, who is a guardian, a power of attorney, an accountant, a banker, someone who is entrusted with the responsibility to handle this vulnerable adult's finances or money or property, and they're breaching that relationship and using that property inappropriately or personally benefiting from that or taking that property for themselves. Deceptions would include scams. We have lots of lottery scams out there, telephone scams, service repair scams, people going door to door offering to fix roofs and then charging someone, either overcharging someone or charging them for work that wasn't completed, or extortion, or any unlawful means. So basically that means if someone's taking property of a vulnerable adult by theft, forgery, fraud, those would all be included in abuse of vulnerable adult, and those are all reportable things, types of abuse and incidents that we would want to investigate when it involves a vulnerable adult. Some indicators of exploitation: if there's an unusual volume or type of banking activity, or activity inconsistent with the person's ability, that's an indicator that exploitation may be occurring. One of the most common ones is we'll have someone who resides in a nursing home and they're unable to get out, and we'll see charges on a bank account at a casino and when we knew the person was not able to go to a casino. It could be non-payment of bills. In that case, it's non-payment when the money should be there to be able to pay that bill. Eviction, when a person should have the money to pay for their rent or pay for their care, and they're being evicted anyway due to lack of payment, and we know that money should be there. Maybe because the person, the reason the care of the person isn't consistent with the size of the estate. So a person might be living beyond their means, or maybe the person has money and they're being cared for in a way that, would be someone who has much less money. Missing property or belongings, suspicious signatures on checks or other documents. You don't always have to be an expert in handwriting to be able to see that a check has been forged. Maybe we have a caregiver who doesn't have any means of their own support, and they're only relying on the person they're providing cares for to make sure their needs are being met when it really should be the other way around. Signing blank checks, so if the vulnerable adult's signing a check and just handing it over without any amounts written in there. Or purchases of items that really don't benefit the person. It could be boats, cars, sports equipment, real estate. Purchasing items, when someone is entrusted to handle finances of someone, they're supposed to be using that money for the benefit of that vulnerable adult and not for their own benefit. Or it could be transfers of ownership or property to a new friend or relative or someone who really didn't have much involvement with the adult's life previous to that transfer. And of course, the person's report of being financially exploited. Some behavioral indicators of exploitation could be implausible explanations about someone's finances. Someone who's unaware, doesn't understand their financial arrangements. That could be a red flag that they're really at risk to being financially exploited. Maybe someone's concerned or confused about missing funds from their account and they're unaware of how that happened. Abrupt changes in a will or other financial documents or financial arrangements. And especially, and really in the last one, there's a change in spending habits. When you see really abrupt changes in spending habits, a lot of cases when we have vulnerable adults, they'll have consistent patterns of spending. They're paying their utility bills, their life insurance, their credit cards, and all of a sudden charges are happening all over the place in casinos and liquor stores and places where the person maybe doesn't frequent very much. And so those are changes in habits, and those are red flags to be aware of if you see financial records. Some common characteristics of abusive caregivers. So we've talked a lot about the indicators of all these different types of abuse, neglect, and exploitation, but some of the caregivers who are involved in these abusive situations, and someone who's not a caregiver but is a family member or someone other in a relationship, these are some characteristics that we commonly see in those individuals. There may be substance abuse problems or mental illness problems, someone who doesn't have experience providing care and they're providing care that's really beyond their abilities. Maybe they're a reluctant caregiver, a family member, or someone who's kind of been forced in the role of caregiving, and since they're reluctant, they may not be providing the cares that are needed. Maybe they have a history of abuse. We'll see if someone has a history of abuse, they're more likely to abuse again. A lot of cases we'll see dependency, where a family member or caregiver becomes financially dependent on the victim or on the vulnerable adult, and when that person needs the money for their own use, when the vulnerable adult needs their money for their own use, the person who's dependent on them doesn't allow that to happen. Even sometimes we have people who are overly friendly or helpful, and it's really kind of a way to disarm a person who's maybe concerned. They also may have some personality traits that are common for people who are abusive, and they may be hypercritical or impatient with people who are trying to help that vulnerable adult. Maybe they're empathetic towards the efforts of others or the needs of others. They may be a person, they're not really. They're blaming the victim. They think that all the problems are associated with how the victim is handling things. They might have unrealistic explanations for what the person can do for themselves or what the person needs. Maybe they're losing self-control, and maybe that's due to some sort of behavioral health problem, mental illness, or some other type of behavioral issue. And maybe they're feeling of a loss of independence. So a person who's in a caregiving role, especially when it comes to family members, when they're really spending all their time caring for themselves or caring for their family member, they lose a lot of their own abilities to have their own life, and that kind of may result in some anger and frustration, and then a person becomes reluctant or becomes abusive. Some behavioral indicators of abusive caregivers, they may be verbally abusive, berating or harassing. Maybe they're causing threats to be made, or maybe isolating a person from friends or family members. Maybe they're giving implausible explanations, treating a person like an infant, so they're treating a person not as their age, leaving a person alone for a long period of time when they need that supervision, withholding affection, especially when it comes to family members. Maybe they're unwilling to comply with service providers and planning for their care. There's a lot of different behavioral indicators of abuse, that could be giving a person no privacy or speaking for another person, denying a person the right to make their own decisions. So, if a person is still able to make their financial decisions, but that caregiver is not allowing them to make those decisions, that could definitely be an indicator. They could also be demonstrating inappropriate sexual relationships. Maybe they're a paid caregiver and they're acting as a boyfriend or a girlfriend. That could definitely be a behavioral indicator of some abuse going on. Handling a person roughly or in a manner that is threatening when they're providing cares, or even when they're in a normal situation, or maybe they're expressing excessive concern about the caring for an adult, or reluctant about reporting or spending any money or paying any bills on behalf of that vulnerable adult. Those all behavioral indicators of abusive caregivers. So many of these indicators of abusive caregivers don't necessarily mean that there's abuse occurring, but they're definitely indicators that we need to be aware of the situation. And if you're involved in a case where you see some of these indicators, you need to take a closer look or make a report to have Adult Protective Services take a closer look. Just become aware of, and they should send up some red flags that there's a situation that could be abusive, neglectful, or exploitative. You may, when you're talking to someone who is a perpetrator of abuse, neglect, or exploitation, you may come across a lot of suspicious explanations for all these various types of abuse. And they may say the injury was an accident when it really doesn't look like something that happened accidentally, or the person fell when maybe that person needed to have a lift and two caregivers providing a lift, and they shouldn't be falling on their own, they shouldn't be left alone. Maybe they say, oh, they bruise easy, so that doesn't mean there's abuse. Well, there's always a cause for abuse. Many people bruise easily, but there's a reason for why they're bruising. So we still want to look at the location and how that occurred, and if it's bilateral or what other explanations that may make sense for that bruising. When it comes to financial exploitation, they may say, oh, it's a gift, or she was just paying me back the money that she owed me, or he gave me permission to use it or borrow it. We see a lot of those explanations occurring, and sometimes they occur when a person doesn't have the ability to loan out money, and they don't have that mental ability anymore, that capacity anymore, and they don't have the ability to loan money, so how would someone be able to borrow it? And then if they may say, I was going to give the money back. Well, they've had the money for a long time, and they have never given it back. In cases of caregiver neglect, he refuses services, he doesn't want any help. We'll see people that talk about how they don't want to go to the hospital, they don't want doctors involved, but the caregiver still has a responsibility to make sure that person is being treated and being treated humanely and being cared for appropriately. So what happens when you make a report? When you make a report to that hotline, you're going to talk to an intake worker, and they're going to screen that information that is provided by you. They're going to look to see if there's an indication that the person is a vulnerable adult. So if you're making a report, you want to have information that the person has some sort of substantial mental impairment or functional impairment, or that a person has a guardian appointed. They're also going to screen it to see if there's an indicator that the reported abuse meets the definitions of abuse defined in the APS Act. And those are the definitions that we talked about previously. They're also going to, if the report meets that screening criteria, they're going to assign it to a local APS worker, and that local APS worker is going to go out and meet with the victim and talk to other people involved in this case, and conduct an investigation. So the APS worker, they investigate the reports of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. If there's a need and they validated that abuse, neglect, or exploitation, they develop a service plan to create a plan for services needed to prevent, discontinue, or correct abuse. Many cases, especially when it involves agencies or facilities, the person who has been abused or exploited or neglected is safe. They fired the employee or caregiver who was responsible for it, and the person's safe now. In those cases, Adult Protective Services is not going to create a service plan if the person's safe. But if a person continues to be unsafe, they will create those service plans. And then they'll also arrange services, they'll make referrals, they'll work with other agencies or persons to help provide services to help make that person safe. And those services can include medical care, mental health care, legal services, fiscal management, housing or shelter, home health care, food or clothing. The Adult Protective Services workers, really, their primary goal is to make sure that person is safe. And many times there's community services in place or agencies in the community that are able to get the care, and they just need to make contact with that person or or contact the family members to create an informal plan to make sure the person's safe as well. Some things that the Adult Protective Services worker cannot do: they cannot provide services to an adult who is refusing them. We'll talk about some of the exceptions to that in just a few moments. Adult Protective Services worker cannot take an adult into custody or become the guardian for that adult. Adult Protective Services does assist with guardianships in a lot of cases. The only times that Adult Protective Services does assist with guardianships or conservatorships is when it's related to a report of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. In other cases, anyone can make a petition for a guardian conservatorship, and Adult Protective Services just focuses on specifically those cases where that guardian or conservator is needed to prevent further abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Adult Protective Services workers cannot arrange for a placement without the vulnerable adult's consent or consent from a guardian if they have one appointed. And all those services that we talked about that are provided are voluntary unless there's an emergency and there's no other alternatives, or all the other alternatives have failed, and the victim doesn't have the ability to protect themselves or the capacity to make a decision to accept services. And if those three conditions are met and a court orders temporary involuntary services or placement, then those services can be provided. It has to be from a court order. A judge has to order it, and generally law enforcement is involved, especially when there's someone who's being placed involuntarily. Law enforcement has to go out. Those situations are very rare. Generally, the courts are going to appoint a temporary guardian, and that guardian's going to place that person in a safe place with the assistance of Adult Protective Services. The goals of Adult Protective Services: Adult Protective Services' primary goal is to prevent, discontinue, or correct abuse using the least restrictive, least intrusive means necessary. We don't want to jump right into placing someone in a nursing home or jump right into appointing someone a guardian. If there's alternatives that are less restrictive, we want to use those first. Adult Protective Services wants to ensure the vulnerable adult is safe in their home or out-of-home placement wherever they're currently residing, and if they need to move to a different place, we'll assist them with that as well. Adult Protective Services assist the vulnerable adult to remain in their home as long as possible and as long as it's appropriate. If it's not possible anymore and it's not an appropriate placement, we'll assist them in finding an appropriate place. But like I mentioned before, we can't force anyone to move without their consent or without that court order for involuntary services. We want to restore independent functioning to the greatest extent possible. So if someone is able to live independently, maybe they just need a home health care or some sort of assistance in the home, we will help to arrange that and try to get that put into place. And we also want families and caregivers to be better able to care for their family members and their vulnerable adults who are family members, and also arrange necessary services or legal assistance to help protect that person. That might include contacting county attorneys or police for legal charges, criminal charges, or working with the courts to have a guardian appointed or or conservator appointed. Some of the philosophy of Adult Protective Services: vulnerable adults have the right to protection from abuse, neglect, or exploitation. They also have the right to self-determination and to participate in decisions affecting their life. One of the primary philosophies, as mentioned before, we want to use the least restriction necessary on their personal liberty as possible. Also, as I mentioned before, vulnerable adults can choose to live in harmful and self-destructive ways, provided they have the capacity to choose that. They do not harm others, aren't committing crimes. And of course, we wanted to treat people in a private manner with confidentiality and respect. We don't want to broadcast all this stuff it was related to abuse, neglect, and exploitation to other people, because it's a private situation that we need to handle appropriately. I thank you for your time today. Remember to report abuse. Call 1-800-652-1999. Thank you.